Hey friends, welcome back to another Seed Talk with Layne and Lisa. Good morning, Layne.
Good morning. How's it going?
It is going really well. Is this not like the most beautiful fall in Virginia the weather is just optimal, right?
It is. It's perfect. This is perfect baking weather, knitting weather, outdoor
Sitting
work weather.
outside, sitting in the sunshine, reading a book, literally. I actually
Yes.
thought about that yesterday. And, just a little side note that I planted our cover crops about a week and a half ago, right before a little light rain that we had. And we've had no rain since then. And our cover crops are just sprouting and beautiful. And anyway, it just really is so far so good on a great fall season. So friends, if you're new here to Seed Talk, we welcome you. Layne and I spend our days together at the gardener's workshop, where Layne is the seed manager, and I'm kind of the head bottle washer that pushes the paper and helps to figure things out. And we just are really glad that you're here. This podcast is sponsored by thegardenersworkshop.com. We'd love for you to drop in over there because we have a lot of great stuff and information to help you out. And so, Layne, what are we going to be talking about today?
Well, we've been doing a lot of troubleshooting this fall, and there's another tricky, confusing topic that I think we need to cover, and we've been getting some emails about, and that's flowers that are blooming prematurely. So when we're planting these cool flowers in the fall, we're talking about overwintering them so that they bloom the next spring in most cases. But how about if you plant your flowers on time, you get them in the ground, you're so proud of yourself, they're even growing well, and then they sort of keep growing. Then you start to see buds forming, and then you start to panic.
It's so
So,
true. So true.
yes.
I actually just walked the field before I got on here looking for that very
Yeah.
problem.
Yes. So today we're just going to be talking about the problem of flowers that are supposed to be waiting to bloom in spring, but you're actually seeing them start to try to bloom in the fall and what to do about that. So we'll be going through all that today.
Great.
Okay, so Lisa, what would cause a fall planted cool flower to bloom prematurely? There are probably a few different things that could cause it, but what are some things that come to mind?
Sure. So, a couple of things. First, out of the gate is when people plant too early, which is sometimes really, I know that I did that for the first few years that I was practicing the cool flower concept. And you're so worried you're going to be late and you're excited and anxious. So, you get them in the ground and they then kind of mature, start to get established, and it's still warm and the days are still having good length, the day length. We aren't really into winter short days yet, and they can actually start to bloom or to set buds, and sometimes even to go on to bloom. And then it's when you do everything right, you think, and then the weather causes havoc,
Yes.
right? By fall just going on and on and on, and meaning it's like it doesn't get cold kind of when it's supposed to. So your plants, again, they're stressed, they're confused, and some of them will set bud. And I'm sure we're going to talk about what you do about that, but it doesn't concern me. And I get a lot of messages of people that are so worried because their stuff is blooming, and really we'll just step back and deal with it as it happens.
So the most common, like you said, is probably perhaps you planted too early, but again, you could have planted on time and there was just a warm spell that came along unexpectedly and that made your plants grow too big and mature too fast. How about stress in general?
Oh, sure. So any type of stress can make plants misbehave, whether that means they get stunted or they set bud prematurely. But yes, stress. And what is stress? Stress is anything they aren't expecting, right? Too hot, too cold, not enough water, too much water, not enough sun or too much sun. All of those things contribute. Think for just a second, what stresses you out? How many different
Yeah.
things? Well, it's same is true for your plants.
Yeah. And maybe some people have even experienced flowers that are setting bud in the trays, in their little 3/4 inch soil blocks. Maybe you forgot about a tray and it's just been sitting there and you actually see them putting on buds on these little short seedlings. Has that ever happened to you, Lisa?
Oh, yes. And particularly, I did it years ago. We grow squash we start squash in the 2-inch soil block, right? So that's a pretty big block because it's a big seed. Well,
Yeah.
I started a bunch for a photo shoot. Well, it was way too early to plant them outside. So I decided to just leave the tray in my grow room where it was nice and toasty. They had light. And we literally, not only did those squash bloom in that 2-inch tray or 2-inch block, they actually set fruit. It was unbelievable because
Oh, wow.
I helped it with its pollination, and it was pretty amazing. Anyway, so yeah, anything is possible.
Wow. That is pretty amazing. And this is another time we might want to note, if you do live in a warmer climate and you're experiencing this, you may want to think about planting later in the fall.
Yeah.
In terms of the standard cool flower fall planting times to use as a jumping off point, we always say get transplants in the ground or direct seed 6 to 8 weeks before your first expected fall frost. Maybe you did 8 weeks this year. Well, maybe next year try 6 weeks. Or
Yeah.
I even know of a lot of people in warmer climates that do it at 4 weeks just because of this very reason.
Yeah, and I have mentioned from time to time that because I mean, I don't even know how many years it is now, but I'll just say for the last 5 years, we've had these kind of unreliable fall seasons. And totally agree with that, Layne, that I am now planting later than earlier because planting later, you can bring in hoops and row covers to create low tunnels to kind of provide some warmth to your plants if it gets cold really quick. But there's not really anything you can do if it heats up and you plant too early. So I always err on later than earlier for fall planting nowadays.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about which flowers might be a little more prone to this behavior. Of course, the chances of it happening to any flower go up if you've planted much too early or if your warm weather goes on for a really long time. But I'll tell you the two flowers that we hear the most complaints about are Sweet William and Snapdragons. And I'm going to throw in Rudbeckia, Black-Eyed Susans as a runner-up. Would you agree with that assessment, Lisa?
So very, very true. And I will say that in the Rudbeckias, I find that Indian Summer, which is one that we've grown forever, there's always one 3-inch stem with a huge bloom blooming in our garden, about November or December. It's really kind of funny. I've come to rely on it. I often cut it and take it inside, right? But yeah, Sweet William is famous for blooming in the tray. And I find that with Amazon, but I mostly grow Amazon. So it may actually happen with many other varieties. But yeah, and snaps are because everybody, snaps are a really, really important crop to flower farmers. So people are overly cautious, but I'll tell you that we now succession seed start in the fall for this very reason, to make sure we have good size plants to plant in the event that something like that happens.
So do you do that succession seed starting with any other flowers?
Pretty much just those. I mean, in the beginning of the season kind of brings that onto my radar. So if we start on time and the seedlings are doing great and they're looking wonderful and we're seeing, oh my gosh, looking at the forecast, fall is never going to end. The weather is just not turning. Bobo will sometimes just restart many of those snaps. We primarily do that on snapdragons only. But I have been known to do it on Sweet William on occasion. And then you may be thinking, well, what do you do with all those extra plants? Some of those plants are destined to be composted. That is their purpose. Because we don't have extra space to have a whole nother planting of snaps or Sweet William because we plant a ton of those, right? And that you just, as a business person, that is your insurance policy. How many of us pay insurance premiums year after year, but you don't use that insurance? It's the very exact same thing. So if the weather is not looking promising, like it's going to be hot now for 8 more weeks and our snaps are in the ground, sometimes we'll restart in case they start to get so large that we're afraid they're not going to make it through the winter. And excessive pinching is not the answer.
So doing some succession seed starting is a really good option as a backup and insurance policy if there are any flowers that tend to give you this sort of trouble.
Yep.
Have you modified your planting times for any of these specific flowers that are prone to this behavior, or have you just modified your overall planting time to be later?
So we've done the two things. We've planted later in the fall than we used to. And then we actually do this succession seed starting, not necessarily planting. Half of those plants are not actually going to be planted out in the garden. They're there just in case.
So now we're going to talk about what you should do for your plants if this is happening. And I'm going to break it up into branching and single stem. So what would you do, Lisa, if you have, let's say, Sweet William, it's a branching plant. What would you do if you started to see buds set after you've planted it out there in the field?
Okay, so I tend to first off not do anything until winter, until the cold weather starts. Because if you pinch a plant and it's still warm conditions out, the plant is just going to continue to grow more stems, right? I mean, it's going to do what it's going to continue doing that. And the only time that I actually pinch in the fall winter time is if the stem is really getting tall. If it's over 12 or 18 inches, which just makes it more vulnerable to cold damage and wind whipping. But I use row covers for wind protection, so that's not as much as a threat, because pinching stresses plants. And for a stressed plant to go into a stressful season of cold is just kind of a double whammy. So my preferred method is to ignore it in the fall and winter. And then in very early spring, and I say that over and over, very early spring. Very early spring, as we define it, is 6 to 8 weeks before your last spring frost. So for me here in southeastern Virginia, that's like Valentine's Day. That's when our second planting of cool flowers goes in, but that is also the time that I'll take down covers, not necessarily leaving them off. Sometimes we do, and patrolling for that type of behavior. And that's when I would pinch them, because excessive pinching leads to puny stems because the plant overproduces.
So even if you see a plant with all these buds on it, or what if it's even starting to bloom, would you still just leave it there?
Yep. So if it's that big and large, then I might cut it. But because we use, if it'll fit under a row cover, under the low tunnel, I might just leave it. But usually, first off, I don't see this behavior in like all the plantings of a particular plant. There's always like one or two renegades, right? That just kind of like shoot it up. So I don't feel so bad about cutting it back in winter, which stresses it and risk killing the plant. It just won't recover is what happens. So you just kind of have to go with it. And again, it's usually not so many plants that, oh, well, if you feel like cutting it, cut it. And if it doesn't survive, guess what? You got a bunch of other plants.
So if it's really large, you might consider cutting it. If it fits under a row cover, you would just leave it there, right, buds and all, and see what happens in very early spring.
Yes.
Okay, how about for a single stem plant? What if someone's growing a single stem stalk and they see it starting to put on buds or even bloom? What would you do in that case?
Leave it. I mean, there's no recourse because it's a single stem plant. And oftentimes, as trying to remember, last year for Chinese forget-me-nots, which are in fact are not single stems, they're multiples, but they, just like stock, oftentimes, and stock is a single stem, oftentimes will set their buds while the stems are fairly short and kind of give you a little heartburn thinking, oh my gosh, they're not going to be very tall. What am I going to do with those, And in fact, they really put on the acceleration extension during the last days. So for a single stem, you have no recourse but to leave it. You need to take care of it. You need to be sure that you're watering it properly and that it has the nutrition it needs. But I find our stock, the first cut is kind of squatty, but then they just start elongating and getting it. So be patient is the bottom line. Stop being a helicopter plant grower, which is what we're all guilty of, right?
Oh, yes, because we love them.
Exactly. Hovering is okay, but you can't let it make you make the wrong decision.
Now, what if someone had an entire bed of stock, for example, and pretty much all the plants are actually blooming?
I'd still leave it. I mean, let it bloom out because you just don't know. And again, like the one that you're looking at there that's in this image. And again, reminder to everybody, Layne always makes a beautiful slideshow to go along with our podcast that you can see over here on YouTube. You just don't know what the plants are going to do, but there's no recourse. You either count it a loss and leave it, or pull it out. There is nothing to be done.
Yeah. So what if someone has these plants row covered? It's a nice cozy environment under there. Would you recommend taking that row cover off to kind of cool the plants down just a touch?
Yeah, so that would definitely work. Growing slow, low, and cool tends to help plants grow more roots and more stem length. So if you, for and let's just say, so we plant stock in February. Valentine's Day is kind of like our key marker, and we typically cover because it's still really cold outside and a lot of whipping wind, right? So we cover after we plant, and if they start setting buds and misbehaving that way, then yes, I would uncover them to kind of take away that added warmth. So yeah, that's a great point.
And what is your track record? It's going to be different for everyone and depending on where they live and the weather, the winter conditions they have that year. What's your track record on these plants? Maybe it's a larger plant and it has some bud set. What do you typically find in very early spring when you go to look at those plants?
The ones that set buds and were problem childs all through winter.
Right.
I mean, usually, again, just saying that there's so few of when that does happen, let's just say in the Rudbeckia bed. I mean, if I get, and we plant typically now, we plant, less than 100 plants, usually per variety. In high production, we would have entire 100-foot beds of just say Indian summer, right? That 100-foot bed of Indian summer might have 5, maybe up to 10 short setters. So you there's so much more abundance of everything else. You really rarely pay attention to it. But I have seen, like in Sweet William, that's another really great offender, right? The one that does it.
Right.
Sometimes when I'm cutting, you're in April and May and you're out there just cutting the tons of cuts, like this image of Amazon that you have displayed here, Sweet William. You cut all those stems that we're looking at, and then down in the understory, you see 3 or 4 of those little shorties that actually set bud and bloomed in fall, and they look exactly the same. So I just kind of count them off, I mean, we don't rely on them.
If someone is experiencing this widespread in a bed, would you recommend, if they have time, if they believe they're going to be able to restart and they have the bed space, would you recommend they do another planting to be safe?
Sure. I mean, yes, but I just don't think that is really for us. We've never experienced that. Let's put it that way.
So Lisa, any final words for someone who's stressing out after finding some of their plants budding up this fall?
Sure. I would say, first off, don't be alarmed. It happens to all of us. It's more about the plants than you or what you've done most often. And just feel confident that you can just leave it alone, and rectify it in very early spring before the plants start growing again. Snipping off that little shorty that went through winter may stimulate more stems to actually grow from that plant. But this is also just another great example of why we always plant more than what we think we need to cover those kinds of issues, right?
And again, if this is something you seem to be experiencing every year on a large percentage of your plants, really consider experimenting with planting a bit later and maybe even doing some of that succession seed starting that we mentioned earlier, just as an insurance policy for some of the plants that seem to give you the most trouble.
Yep.
All right, well, that does it for this episode of Seed Talk. I hope that helped alleviate some of the panic that might be going on if you're seeing some of your fall planted cool flowers budding up. Thank you so much for joining us. As always, we love seeing your comments over on YouTube, and we love when you like over there. And in a podcast app, we love when you leave reviews or ratings. We really, really appreciate it. And just thanks so much for joining us again, and make sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening or watching.
And friends, if you over on YouTube, Layne really loves your comments and answers them. So we love the comments, and all of that activity really helps YouTube and the podcast apps to show our podcast to more people. And we appreciate that. And remember, over at thegardenersworkshop.com, we have a fully stocked online garden shop of all the seeds, tools, and supplies, and my books that you hear us mention from time to time. And we have an online course library that is packed. So check out thegardenersworkshop.com for whatever your needs are when you're coming to starting seeds and growing flowers. Till we meet again, friends. Ciao.
Bye.